The story begins as a director calls cut on a commercial shoot and praises Frank. He tells his crew to reset for another take. But a crew member complains the phone prop sits too low in frame. The director dismisses it, saying it is just a cutaway. He goes again anyway. Dan, an actor who just wrapped the shoot, chats with a colleague about his weekend. He mentions he and Lisa are heading up to the cabin together. But Dan is worried because Lisa plans to hike alone into the mountains. Snow is forecast up there, making the hike more dangerous. Dan confirms plans for tomorrow at noon on a phone call, nothing more. He asks about taking a boat out after, but gets a hard no. Dan stands outside a suburban home looking uncertain. Jason Segel drives with Samara Weaving beside him. Autumn Mountain Forest establishes their remote travel destination. Lisa asks Dan not to eat protein bars on the drive up. She wants to cook him dinner and needs him hungry. Dan asks about his father, who loves Lisa but mocks Dan constantly. He is utterly embarrassed by his own existence around the man. Lisa asks about Dan's new play and whether he will get the part. Dan calls the theater director a pretentious asshole, and Lisa pushes back. She asks if Dan is saying her films are not art, forcing a fight. The tension builds as Dan begs Lisa to fake happiness for one weekend. But Dan insists he was attacking the director, not her. She calls his compliment about her directing complete bullshit. Dan finds mice in the cabin, and neither of them is pleased. Then Dan and Lisa clash in the kitchen over garlic. He crushes it instead of slicing it, so Lisa corrects him sharply. Garlic wars erupt. She sends Dan out of the kitchen so she can cook alone. Later, Dan, Lisa's boyfriend who planned this entire meal carefully, reveals he ordered rare peppercorns shipped from Ohio. He tells Lisa he wanted the meal to feel truly special. But Lisa tells him steak is not actually her favorite food. Dan is stunned, having cooked it for her countless times. She says her real favorite is ceviche from Peruvian restaurants. Dan brings up Dario, a guy from Lisa's acting class who might be Peruvian. He asks how the script Lisa and Dario are writing together is going. She says it is great, and Dan forces cheerful agreement he does not feel. The plot thickens as Dan plays the word Zek in Scrabble 4, a triple score. Lisa challenges it and loses, which means Dan wins the points. She is furious. Then Lisa scores 28 points back and Dan accuses her of memorizing cheap trick words. He calls the whole game bullshit, so the evening sours fast. Dan tries a joke to save the mood. But Lisa tells him she is going to bed, cutting him off cold. Alone, Dan watches a TV show where a cast member gets called, someone's sad sack of a husband. He does not laugh. Then Dan starts running lines from a script involving a mayor demanding, "What gives you the right?" Dan spies on a neighbor through the cabin window. He drifts down to the basement workshop, surrounded by tools. The script lines grow darker, circling a power struggle. Dan notices a medicine bottle sitting on the counter. He stares at the bottle, not moving. Then the script line hits him. "What gives you the right, Dan?" Dan jolts awake on the couch. Hearing this, Lisa tells him bluntly he peed on himself in his sleep. She holds up the cleaning fluid, calmly asking what it is for. Dan stumbles through an excuse about the dirty window. But Lisa presses harder, asking about the rocks she found in the boat. She tells him she saw him with them, so Dan panics and demands answers back. He screams when he finds Lisa is holding a taser. Lisa fires it and Dan goes down hard. The situation spirals as Dan hits the ground from Lisa's taser and begs her to act like an adult. She keeps the taser trained on him, refusing to stop. Then Dan lays out Lisa's full plot, knock him out and strangle him. He says she planned to drag him to the boat and tie him to rocks. He is close. Dan spots the saw and demands to know what it is for. Lisa tells him bodies float unless someone cuts them up first. Dan is horrified. He demands to know why she wants him dead in the first place. So Lisa tells him she watched him sleep with another woman at a party he brought her to. Dan, Lisa's husband of 7+ years, insists she never touched him for 2 years. She fires back that he made her feel worthless every single day. But Dan wanted a wife, not a critic, and Lisa wanted a grown man, not a baby. Dan calls her plan pathetic. Lisa corrects him. Her plan is still running. She set up the hunting trip so she could shoot Dan and claim an accident. Henry, Dan's handyman who served time with him, shows up and startles them both. Rachel stops by to wish Dan happy hunting, without knowing she is Lisa's alibi. Dan narrates Lisa's cover story. He tripped, the gun fired, and his head splattered. He is horrified that her plan is just to shoot him. But Lisa insists it was considerate because she cooked dinner first. Dan strikes back, telling Lisa the cops will see through her because she is a terrible actress. She lacks presence and the police will never buy her story. Then the scene shifts to Dan performing an absurd, theatrical grief act over Lisa's body. He screams at God to bring her back and declares heaven is not ready for her. He hopes out loud that Lisa's beauty survived death. The chaos escalates as Dan finishes his fake grief performance and signals Henry. Henry just stands there, missing the cue completely. Dan starts hinting it's hammer time, but Henry stares blankly. He repeats it 5 times, getting more desperate each pass. Henry still doesn't move. Dan finally screams at Henry to hit Lisa with the hammer right now. Henry swings, and Dan's murder plan is finally messily in motion. Later at a theme park, Dan meets Henry to finalize the plot, because Henry picked somewhere loud and hard to surveil. Henry reminds Dan he is the one with leverage here, so Dan needs to stay polite. Then Henry demands $50,000 plus a written friendship agreement, or he walks. Dan refuses to put a murder contract on paper and tells Henry to show up on time. Back at the cabin, Lisa wakes up taped to a chair and immediately fights back. She tears into Dan for hiring Henry, calling out his cowardice directly. Lisa, Dan's girlfriend, then lists every grievance. He is weak, controlling, lost, their money, their car, their house, and never once supported her career. She admits the real motive. The insurance payout is the only escape from their shared debt. But then Henry blurts out the policy is only $100,000, and Lisa corrects him. She tells Henry the real figure is $1 million, and Dan lied about the amount. Dan and Lisa immediately start outbidding each other for Henry's loyalty, going from $500,000 to $750,000 to a full $1 million. Lisa even offers Henry a date with Rachel to seal the deal. Henry snaps, turning the gun on Dan for lying to him. The 3 struggle over the weapon and it fires accidentally, leaving everyone frozen in shock. Dan and Lisa scream at each other over who pulled the trigger. The brawl continues with no one in control and no plan left standing. The real trouble starts when someone stabs Dan in the foot mid-brawl. He screams, and the 3-way fight breaks apart completely. Henry lands a hit and laughs, but nobody controls the situation. Dan flees the cabin, leaving Lisa and Henry still fighting. Meanwhile, a news broadcast names escaped convicts Pete Hughes and Todd Templeton, plus their hostage Allegra Danvers, a correctional officer, telling viewers a manhunt is expanding north. Pete mocks the stupid hat left behind, but all 3 are hiding in a stolen cabin. Pete, Dan's situation's mirror opposite, orders them to stay put for days, then steal a car. Todd spots someone outside and wants to jump them, but Pete shuts it down, fearing more arrivals. Todd gets caught outside, and they scramble, finding the hidden key above the doorframe. Allegra wants to kill the strangers outright, but Pete, who needs her alive, overrules her. Todd walks Allegra, Pete's hostage correctional officer, to the bathroom because she refuses to hold it. She insists she has dignity. Allegra says she is bored, and Pete just tells her to stay bored. Pete sarcastically offers charades, and Todd immediately agrees, so the game begins. The guesses spiral into screaming with nobody close to right. Todd acts out something and nobody stops shouting long enough to listen. He nails it. Pete stares when he learns it is Mamma Mia, completely baffled it is her favorite film. The reckoning comes as Pete stands over Dan and Lisa with a knife, demanding to know what is on their steak. He claims the seasoning is special Ohio pepper, and Pete actually buys it. Pete then introduces himself, Todd, and Allegra to their stunned captives. He calls Dan and Lisa Ron and Hermione, so they stay dehumanized. Hearing this, Dan and Lisa argue over who actually shot Todd, exposing their fractured relationship to Pete. Pete is fascinated. Dan, who is Pete's hostage, demands to know what Pete wants. Pete says he and Todd need cash, so Allegra jumps in and tells them she helped Pete escape because they are in love. Pete confirms their escape plan hit a cash shortfall. Dan offers the $200 ceramic pot upstairs, but Pete mocks it as barely blender money. So Dan and Lisa bicker over their finances, accidentally revealing they are broke until Pete pulls out a large knife. Pete offers to lower the knife if Dan tells him where the real money is. Lisa begs Pete not to hurt them, but Pete just launches into a story. Allegra tries to stop Pete, but he accuses her of micromanaging him and keeps going. Pete describes a prison game where guards dragged inmates to the laundry room and forced them to fight. He tells Dan the loser gets assaulted, so Dan has one option: tell Pete where the money is. Dan insists he truly has nothing and even overdrew his account months ago, stopping Pete cold. Pete corners Dan anyway, saying he wants to watch Dan's eyes when the knife goes in. But Dan spots a movie poster on the wall and asks Pete about it, halting the attack. Pete admits it is his film, so Dan claims he directed it, leaving Pete completely stunned. The betrayal cuts deep, but Pete tells Dan he has watched the film multiple times in prison. He and Todd saw it together on movie night, which means they genuinely love Dan's work. Pete calls it a very good film. Then Dan and Pete debate the ending, and Dan admits producers forced a happy ending against his wishes. Pete tells Dan he has a real voice as a filmmaker and should have fought harder for it. Dan thanks him, saying it means a lot. But Pete snaps back to reality and orders the situation to resume, leaving Dan screaming in terror. Pete forces Dan to open his eyes. He orders Dan to say goodbye to Lisa before he kills him, so Dan desperately searches for a way out. Dan stops Pete by offering $50,000 cash from a bank in town when it opens. Pete accepts the deal immediately. Later, Lisa breaks down and asks Dan how they ended up like this. She tells him she was deeply in love with him and believed they would always face the world as a team. Then Lisa confesses her affair with Dario, saying she does not even know why she did it. She says she thinks she wanted Dan to fight for their relationship, so she let herself get caught. Dan, Lisa's boyfriend, dismisses her entirely and says Pete will kill them anyway. Meanwhile, Pete tells Todd the plan: take Lisa and Dan to the bank, get the money, kill them both, then cross the border. Todd argues against ditching the Volvo, calling it disrespectful after everything it has done for them. Pete ends the debate. Then Allegra yells from below, so Pete sends Todd down to handle her. Todd finds that Dan needs to use the bathroom, and Pete reluctantly allows it. He warns Dan not to try anything, but Dan swears he just needs to go, buying himself a possible moment to escape. As the day unfolds, Pete forces Dan outside at gunpoint. He orders Dan to go potty, stripping away any dignity Dan has left. Then Pete hovers his finger near Dan's face, taunting him. He keeps repeating he is not touching Dan, just to show who is in control. But Pete calls out for Allegra next. Todd staggers forward, barely conscious, leaving Pete furious. Todd tells Pete that Allegra, Dan's fellow captive, hit him with a sock to knock him out. Pete can't believe it. So he tells them Allegra cannot have gone far and orders a search. Pete takes the forest and sends Todd down the road. Meanwhile, Allegra hides alone, desperately trying to think of a plan. But Pete finds her crouching, catches something hidden in her hand, and rips it away. He then tells her the money deal is dead because they hit him, so now both of them must die. Allegra begs Pete to reconsider. He mocks every plea she makes, saying that is what everybody says. Then she tells Pete she is 12.5 weeks pregnant with a baby, girl desperate to survive. Pete doubts her. She confesses it is an affair baby, not Dan's child. He reacts with fake sympathy for Dan, calling him poor old Ron Weasley. So Pete agrees, only not to shoot her stomach, still planning to kill her. Allegra refuses to accept it. A struggle erupts and Pete screams that something hit his eyes, losing his grip on the situation. The plot unravels as Dan and Pete brawl violently on the ground. He screams and fights back with everything he has. Someone shouts, "Die, you cunt!" forcing the fight to its breaking point. Then Todd, barely conscious, mutters, "Dumbledore, I caught the snitch." He goes still. Pete screams Todd's name and finds his partner dead. He grabs the boat keys and screams he will kill everyone. Pete is devastated and furious, so the threat against Dan and Lisa turns absolute. Dan tells Lisa this is all his fault. He confesses he got scared when they fell apart and simply gave up. He is sorry. Then Pete's crew closes in, so Dan tells Lisa to run too, the boat without him. He tells her he knows she is pregnant and it is not his, but he still wants her safe. Lisa stops him. She was lying about the pregnancy just to stall Pete. Dan, Lisa's boyfriend, calls it the best acting he has ever seen. But Pete's crew catches them and a brutal fight erupts, leaving Pete's arm broken. Dan and Lisa break free. Todd reappears alive and confronts Pete's crew, screaming his own name proudly. Pete grabs Lisa again and holds her hostage, regaining control of the situation. He monologues that killing has grown boring, so he plans to shove someone's face into a lawnmower. The drama intensifies as Pete drags Dan and Lisa toward a running lawnmower. He screams that someone's face is going in, so Lisa begs him to stop. Pete refuses and shoves closer, forcing the blade near their faces. It's real. Pete drives someone into the mower and screams fill the cabin yard, leaving Dan helpless. But the lawnmower attack leaves the cabin window smashed. Pete spots the damage and demands to know who did it. He is furious. Meanwhile, Mike Burton, Dan's estranged father, gets a call from neighbor Carl Marshall. Carl reports a pot on Mike's front lawn and a smashed window. At the cabin, Mike hangs up on Carl and blames Dan immediately. He's done. Mike snatches car keys from a staffer named Kevin and storms out to drive to the cabin. He tears down the road, completely unaware Pete is waiting with a knife. Mike rolls up to the cabin screaming about who smashed his window. Dan freezes, seeing his own father walk straight into Pete's trap. Pete grabs Lisa and threatens to cut her throat unless Mike backs off. Mike charges anyway, so Pete and Todd attack him together. Dan shouts for Mike to look out, but Mike takes a brutal hit. Mike bites Pete's nose in the brawl, buying them seconds. Dan screams for his father as Pete gains the upper hand. Mike tells Dan to get to the car, protecting his son over himself. The escape collapses, and Dan watches his father get beaten down. He can't move. Finally, the attack stops. Dan finds Lisa knocked out on the ground. He shakes her over and over, terrified she won't wake up. Lisa comes around and immediately asks if her hair looks okay after. The bullet grazed it. Dan tells her it looks fine, then tells her to get to the boat. He vows to stop lying to her because he needs to go, back and finish this. Suddenly, Dan tries to open up to Lisa about honesty, but she shuts him down. Lisa tells him this is not the time for that. She is in pain and needs to move. Then Dan asks her to help him up, and she refuses. She tells him she wants to break up instead. He can't believe it. Lisa screams at Dan, calling him a coward and threatening to cut him. She shouts she knew she never should have quit her job for him. Back at the scene, Pete tries to get his gun working as Allegra watches. Pete begs Allegra to let him go, claiming he was brainwashed and sees her as human now. But Allegra dares Pete to shoot her, warning every federal agent will hunt him. Pete silences her and forces Dan toward the bank at gunpoint. Pete mocks Dan for abandoning Lisa, but Dan says they technically broke up. He orders Dan to rob the bank for $50,000 or die. Pete threatens to leave Dan in a trunk like he did his own sister, leaving Dan furious. Dan attacks Pete and the two brawl violently. Lisa reappears and tells them both they deserve each other. Pete announces he will kill Lisa himself since Dan was too cowardly to do it. Dan charges at Pete, screaming at him to get away from his wife. Pete tells Dan he liked his movie, but there won't be a sequel. Dan finally overpowers Pete and the fight ends. Finally, Dan tells Pete and Todd they can go to hell. The fight is over and Dan is still standing. He reaches Lisa and tells her it is okay. She is alive. A naval mine with ropes sits submerged below the dock. Mike Burton sits bloodied on the dock. Someone tells Dan the police are almost there. They even found his severed fingers, handing them back. Dan apologizes to Lisa for trying to kill her. She apologizes right back, and neither holds it against the other, but they still face losing everything they had before. So Dan tells her they deal with all of it together. He already has a plan. Dan pitches a news crew their story as a survival love story. Lisa calls Dan her husband on camera, sealing the new version. The newscast names Mike Burton, Dan's father, as a hero. Dan tells the interviewer they survived because of love. Then the interviewer announces Hollywood is making their story into a movie. Dan and Lisa confirm they are finally making a film together for streaming. Later, that movie is being filmed, with an actor playing a villain threatening Dan. The villain gets hit in the groin and the whole crew laughs. The director calls cut, and Camille asks nervously if he did well. Dan tells Camille he was great and refuses another take. Dan and Lisa survive the worst night of their lives and turn it into a hit movie together.